Hello, YPO. How you doing? It's Keith Alper, and I am very fortunate and honored to be the chair this year of YPO Innovation. Thank you for joining us on this cast. We've got hundreds of YPOers around the globe, so thank you for taking time out of your day and joining us. Before we go on with this exciting cast, I want to introduce two people. I'm going to introduce you to Kate Rogers, who's with CNBC, who's our partner. CNBC is a partner with YPO, is our media partner. We're excited to have them today. And Kate will interview Brad. Brad and I go back about 20 years. We met each other in a group called EO when I had hair and Brad had short hair. We were able to build YEO in this really exciting time to meet Brad. This is Innovation Week. We're in it. We started in Melbourne on Monday. We've had several events around the globe, several Genie casts. So again, thank you for participating. I would like to thank the over 100 YPO champions that are helping make Innovation Week what it is in our second year. So thank you to the champions. And if you know those champions, thank them for taking time out of their days and weeks and years to make this happen for our YPO members. But I also want to thank our sponsors. And, we have a number of sponsors that are involved, but we have 4 key sponsors. Smartsheet, NASDAQ, who is a partner. We're closing the market on Friday. So tune into that and see about 50 of us YPOers close the market. Techstars is a strategic partner, and Brad is the co-founder of Techstars. And Microsoft Surface is a partner too. And we're going to be doing some exciting stuff with them here in New York tomorrow. So again, thank you to our sponsors. So enough of me. I'd like to introduce Kate Rogers, who covers entrepreneurship with CNBC, a partner. And Kate, I'm going to turn it over, and she's going to talk to Brad. And the format today, by the way, is about a half an hour interview with Brad and Kate, and then we're going to open it up to our members. So please get ready, and Kate will remind you also, we'd love to see your face, and Brad would love to meet you. So the more you can do online, we'll unmute your camera and your mic, but we'll be in queue for questions in about a half an hour. If you can't do that, you can chat. You can see where you can chat. We'll send those questions on to Kate. So without further ado, Kate Rogers with CNBC. Kate, take it away.
Keith, thank you so much. And everybody who's tuning in all around the globe from YPO, thank you so much. It's been a really great Innovation Week so far, and we're really honored and excited to have Brad Feld joining us today. So Brad, thank you. Brad is an entrepreneur and has been an early stage investor since 1987. He's co-founder of Foundry Group, which is a VC firm focused on making early stage tech investments, participating in select growth rounds, and identifying and supporting the next generation of VC. And prior to that, he co-founded Mobius Venture Capital and Intensity Ventures. He's also co-founder of Techstars, of course, which helps companies gain startup capital and insight to launch your business through their accelerator and development program. And I've been honored and blessed to have met many of the Techstars participants that Brad is a big part of their success, and we're really thankful to have you here today, Brad. So thank you for joining us.
Okay, thanks a ton.
So we talked with AOL co-founder Steve Case earlier in the week, and we talked quite a bit about the new administration. I mean, politics is on everyone's minds. As somebody who's very ingrained in the startup community and the tech space in particular, what do you think this new administration means for entrepreneurs in this country and abroad?
So at this point, I think I personally have no idea. And I think in general, it's too early to really have clarity on it because there's so much noise relative to signal right now about what's going on. I read a book in 2012 called Startup Communities, which Steve Case wrote the foreword to, and I've learned a lot from Steve through the work that he's done and the work that I've done and things we've done together about the idea of startup communities and developing them all over the world. And in that book, I actually started from the premise that the primary goal of government should be to do no harm. It's sort of the equivalent of the Hippocratic Oath in medicine, sort of in the context of government and sort of government in the dynamic with entrepreneurship. And if you look at the activity of government in general, government can have profound impact on innovation, especially around R&D and R&D investment, fundamental technology creations. We're benefiting from one of them today, right? The investment that was made by the government in the foundational technology behind the internet through DARPA. we couldn't be here without it. And you can just go down the list of all these types of things. If you take the noise at face value, our government or the Trump administration is looking at making massive cuts in this kind of investment in technology, R&D, and fundamental research, which short term, who knows, but long term is foundationally not a good thing. But that's why I say it's hard to know. Like, will these cuts actually translate, or will the sort of noise translate into real structural long-term budgets that, starve our fundamental R&D? Or, will they be just kind of noise at the front end of a process where there's an understanding of the importance of that kind of investment? Same kind of thing about noise around immigration. We know, and I think in Steve's talk, which I watched, he talked really openly about the importance of immigrant founders to what is essentially the incredible American economy. And we've got this massive democratization of innovation happening right now, where you can start a company anywhere in the world. The rise of, not just the rise of the rest in the US, but the incredible activity around the globe, where no longer is the notion that you have to be in the US a precondition to starting a really significant company, is something that we really need to pay attention to, not in a goal of preventing innovation and entrepreneurship from spreading around the world, but using that to motivate us in the United States to engage even more aggressively in continuing to build on the incredible entrepreneurial activity we have.
So you just mentioned immigration. Obviously, that's something I know you've spoken out in the past about. Steve was pretty vocal as well. And you work in the tech space. It's arguably one of the areas that stands to be most impacted by some of the proposals that the administration has put forth and some of the action that they've tried to take. What do you think is the missing link in terms of immigration and getting this administration to understand the viewpoints of entrepreneurs like yourself?
I think it's a broader issue than just this administration. Our immigration system in the U.S., especially around entrepreneurship, has been fundamentally broken for a very long time. In 2010, there was a group of us that started working on what's now being called the Startup Visa. That resulted from our experience. Actually, it was stimulated for me by my experience at Techstars, where we had two companies that came to the Boulder Techstars program in 2008. One from the really terrifying and dangerous country of Canada, and the other from the UK. And neither of them, after going through the 3-month Techstars program, were able to get visas to stay in the US and build their companies in the US. And that's just nuts. And if you look at this, going back to 2010, we still don't have real change in the system. We do have a rule that was put in place called the International Entrepreneurs Rule at the end of the Obama administration that theoretically goes into effect in mid-July that helps with this particular problem. There has been education in USCIS and sort of immigration agency around this type of thing. But if you sort of roll through the system, let's go back to this issue of noise, right? There was an executive order on H-1B visas that came out a month ago. And the immediate knee-jerk response of everybody is, oh my God, H-1B visas are in trouble, and that's going to screw up immigration for tech companies. If you actually read the executive order, it didn't really say much. And it sort of made the assertion that the process change that should be considered is one for companies that are primarily outsourcers versus high-tech companies. And within a couple of days, sort of the noise settled down. People said, well, we're not sure what this means and whether this is really going to impact this. So the challenge right now is the sort of overreaction to specific things that don't really change anything in the context of a system that's complex, but fundamentally flawed. And my hope, we'll see if it plays out. I think Steve did a good job of being optimistic. I'm an optimistic person, so I'd rather be optimistic than pessimistic. But my hope is that over a long period of time versus a very short period of time, we get to a very good and logical place in our country, independent of what the administration is or what the federal government, sort of power dynamics are. And to do that, I think we have to rethink fundamentally how we approach the problem, in addition to sort of talking about the philosophy around the problem. And
Yeah.
by the way, that's a Congress issue, not a president issue. So it's important to continue to recognize that our laws are written by Congress, and that part of the reason nothing's happened in the last 8 years to really fix the immigration problem is because of the dysfunction of our Congress.
Mm-hmm.
And our hope is that going forward, Congress can get organized in a way to be really thoughtful about these things that are so foundational, not just to entrepreneurship and innovation, but the underlying culture of and origin of our country.
Great. I could talk politics all day, but I do want to broaden out a little bit because we do have people.
Because I just talked as much politics as I want to talk for the entire day.
I know. Well, you know what? It's like if you don't want to talk politics, you can't do any interviews for like the next,
It's okay. I accept my reality.
Cool. Thank you. So I want to talk a bit about Foundry Group and some of the themes that you invest in. I know you talk about a cycle of innovation. What do you look for there? What catches your eye?
So we started Foundry Group in 2007, and we're an early stage venture fund that invests in tech companies all across the U.S. So we're based in Boulder, Colorado, but about a third of our investments are in California, about a third of our investments are in Colorado, and about a third of our investments are everywhere else in the U.S. When we started, we had a series of what we like to call deeply held beliefs that defined our strategy. One of those was this idea of being a thematic investor. Now, today, the word theme and the idea of thematic investor gets thrown around to be almost meaningless.
Mm-hmm.
But in 2007, when we raised our first fund, the construct didn't exist. And what we meant by thematic investor was there were a set of themes that were ones that we believed had 20 to 30 year durability,
Mm-hmm.
that we would invest in, make a few investments in the theme, become experts. In some cases, they were themes that we started with themes that we felt like we were already experts in those areas. And then very, very consistently invest in those themes over a long period of time and build the network effect around the themes as well as deep domain knowledge. The themes are abstract, and they're abstract on purpose. They're intellectual constructs for us to use as a filter on what we look at. And they're abstract so that we have flexibility what they mean, but they're also abstract because they cover lots of areas. So for example, if you're an investor today or an entrepreneur today, a trendy area that you might be excited about is virtual reality. And if you go a level deeper, it's now called VR, AR, MR, which is virtual reality, all the way through what's called now mixed reality. Another trendy topic today might be artificial intelligence or AI and big data. Big data was a version of that a couple of years ago. Machine learning is another. We're not really interested in those. We're interested in a theme we call human-computer interaction. And the basis for that theme is the premise that 30 years from now, the way that humans and computers will interact will be radically different than the way we do today. And if you want a proxy for that, just go back 30 years in the past.
Yeah.
Okay. So in some ways, the horizontal theme of HCI subsumes a bunch of those different constructs in different ways. And an example of a company that came out of our HCI theme was Fitbit, which we were early investors in and were very large investors in the company when they went public. And the idea behind Fitbit is this notion of human instrumentation, that as humans, we're going to increasingly interact with computing technology or machines to instrument what's going on. I have a 20 pounds that I'm a marathon runner. I always have 20 pounds that I'm struggling to get rid of. I like to eat. I eat too much. I eat when I'm stressed. I run a lot, and it just.
At least you're running marathons. I think everybody's got 20 pounds they're trying to get rid of.
No, and I just accept reality that I'm a 51-year-old guy, and my metabolism is not burning off all those calories I eat. But so I struggle. So how do you get rid of 20 pounds? Well, the best way to get rid of 20 pounds still is to count calories. Just food restriction. I can run more, it's not going to get rid of the weight. Well, how do you count calories? You can do it through an app like a Fitbit app, you can do it through Weight Watchers. How stupid is it that we are still mechanically doing this thing called counting calories versus having some kind of technology, whether it's a device, it's an implant or ingestible, that's not just keeping track of this data, but helping us regulate in some way. Another example might be anybody who has diabetes. It's still an open loop system. for a diet for monitoring your blood sugar. You monitor your blood sugar, you do tests throughout the day, and you dial in how much insulin you get. There's no good reason why that can't be a closed loop system. And there's no question that at some point in the not too distant future, it'll be a totally closed loop system. So this notion of human instrumentation is a subset of human computer interaction. Mm-hmm. One last example on that thread. We're doing a video conference. I'm in Denver today. I'm at a conference for a company of ours, Full Contact, that's doing their first annual user conference. So I drove down to do this here versus at my house. And I'm sitting in a hotel room, not a particularly compelling hotel room, but it's a hotel room that works. And I'm connected to my phone because my wireless, my LTE is faster than the internet in the hotel. And I'm doing a video conference with you for whatever, an hour. That 20 years ago would have been impossible. 10 years ago would have been impossible. Probably 3 or 4 years ago, CNBC wouldn't have been comfortable doing this. Maybe even, I don't know, when you started doing interviews like this that you were willing to do. And by the way, after this interview is over, it's going to be on YouTube and anybody can watch it. Just like I watched on my drive down this morning. I listened to it, I didn't watch it because I was driving. Steve's interview that he did a week ago. Right, just to get a feeling for what what you were like and what the interview dynamics were like. That's video. For us, that's human-computer interaction. But for sort of non-theme type world, to be, video's hot, we got to do video. So we're constantly trying to change the way we think about these things. And a handful of other themes and companies that sort of are emergent leaders in those other themes. We have a theme called Glue, which if you go all the way back to the 1980s for the people that are on this, listening to this that are my age, it was like middleware. It was technology that connects together other technologies. And that had a different name for many, many years. It's called service-oriented architecture, I think, at some point, or web services. But fundamentally, it's the software that connects machines to machines. Mm-hmm. And we think that there continues to be incredible, significant business opportunities and change in the way technology works around that layer. Marketplaces is another thing that comes up over and over again. The canonical marketplace probably is eBay. But the dynamics of marketplaces, especially in an online world where everyone's connected all the time and has access to things on their phone, can be quite radical, right? Uber is an interesting example of a marketplace that nobody was kind of getting their mind around until all of a sudden it was pervasive. We're an investor in a company called Rover that's a marketplace for dog sitters. And you may say, dog sitters, boy, that sounds, flaky. But if anybody has a pet, what you realize very quickly is that if you need to find somebody to take care of your dog on short notice, it's quite difficult. And the shadow market for people who have dogs in terms of their dogs being taken care of is enormous. Only about 10% of dog owners will use a kennel. And the idea of how do you interact with other people and how do you change this marketplace dynamic where both sides of the equation, time matters, right? I have a dog, I need to find a place for the dog, and somebody has the availability to watch my dog for a period of time. Or I need to go somewhere right now and somebody's in a car near me and they need to have a fare right now. So we try to take these themes, we use them as very, very, very long-term arcs for the investment. And we learn over time. So 20 years from now, I'll be in my 70s, so presumably I still have some connection to this planet, and I'm not completely useless at 70. I think those general themes will still be incredibly impactful on the technology innovation curve.
So when I interviewed you at our Iconic conference, we talked a bit about pitching investors and pitching yourself and authenticity. And I know you mentioned kind of liking to get to know who a person is and kind of connecting with them on a human level and getting past the perfect pitch deck and the slideshow and the nice stock paper and all of those things. What makes a good pitch for someone like you? I'm sure there's plenty of people who'd love to catch your ear and your attention. What does it for you?
I think the key for somebody who's trying to get an investor's attention is to realize there's no generic version. There's no generic way to do it. And the best thing that you probably can do if you're trying to get my attention or someone else's attention is to do some research in advance and understand what that person's interested in. If the thing you're doing doesn't overlap with what that person's interested in, don't waste your time. Mm-hmm. Or if you want, for some reason, that connection, look for a place where what you're doing overlaps with what that person's interested in. Another way, and this is sort of the magic trick for engaging with a busy person, and it doesn't have to do with just investments. It has to do with sales. It has to do with anything that you're recruiting somebody, to your organization or to your board, is figure out a way to engage with something that person's interested in. And before you ask them for something, do something that's helpful to them. Mm-hmm. Think about it in the context of a relationship. If you're in a relationship with someone and you're constantly saying, when that person is busy, how can I help? At some person, my wife, Amy, looks at me and screams and says, stop asking me that.
Just do something for her, right?
Do something. Yeah. I don't want to have to make another decision about what you need to do to help me. The very busy person is in exactly the same place. When you've got so much stimuli coming at you, if somebody says, hey, I'd love to help you, what can I do to help you? My response is, I don't know. What you could do to help me is maybe go away and stop bothering me because I don't have any time, right? Versus here's, for somebody who's very, very public and visible, here's a set of things that I'm working on. Just engage, whether it's engage with a company, engage with content, and do that in a way that helps move that other person's intellectual or functional agenda forward. Doesn't work for everybody. But start from that frame of reference. The last comment I'd say is I have a goal of trying to, this is personally me, I have a goal of trying to engage with anybody who engages with me, but I also have a goal of saying no to everything in 60 seconds. So I'd rather say no right away and not waste your time so that I can spend my time engaging on the things that I'm actually going to do something about. And that doesn't mean that what you're doing is bad. It means that it's just not in a universe that I'm a good person for you. And the very interesting reverse challenge is so many people have difficulty with that because we've been trained, if you hear a no, keep trying, keep going until you hear a yes. And my suggestion for that is shift it on its side. If you hear no, look for another vector into engaging with the person rather than continuing to pound on that same, whatever door you got through that time.
Yeah, I think to build on that a little bit, because it can be helpful for people who do hear no and they still need capital or want that connection, whatever it may be. People don't handle rejection well. So when you do say no in 60 seconds, what ideally would you like to see from someone? Not that there's an appropriate reaction, but how would you like to see somebody handle that bad news and kind of take it and turn it into positive for themselves?
I mean, the irony of the world is because I respond to most people, and I try to respond to everyone. I'm sure I fail at that, but I try. Is that so many people are just appreciative for a response? Mm-hmm. Because think about the number of people you reach out to in this world, and you get no response. Whether you reach out to them, whatever the vehicle, usually it's email now, but whatever it is. Mm-hmm. So I think that. I'm looking for long-term engaged relationships rather than one-time transactional experiences. Mm-hmm. And as part of that, what I really want is, even if you present me with something, I say not interested, it doesn't mean go away, never talk to me again. It just means this thing that you presented to me with, I'm not interested in. Mm-hmm. If the person keeps throwing things at me without ever learning anything about what I am interested in, that's off-putting, and eventually I'll disengage. But if the person starts spending time and understands what I'm interested in, and again, engages with me, with the place where their world and my world link together somehow, then a relationship starts to develop. And, Keith Alper would be a good example of how a relationship develops over a long period of time. I first met Keith through Young Entrepreneurs Organization in the mid-90s. And Keith and I don't think have ever done business directly together. A company I'm involved in at some point may have hired, one of his companies to do something, but I'm not an investor, in what Keith's doing. And he's had plenty of things along the way that I've given him feedback on and tried to be helpful with. But they're not things I'm an investor in. That relationship is way more important to me than whether or not I've got an economic interest in one of those companies that I'm being helpful to. And I'd hope that, using Keith as an example, that his response would be, yeah, Brad's been very helpful to me, even though he doesn't have a direct economic benefit. So the notion of how those relationships work and where the experience ends up being valuable is complicated. I've written a bunch of books. I write about a book a year. My next book is a book called Give First, which has become the mantra of Techstars. And if people are readers, they may have read a book by a guy named Adam Grant a few years ago called Give and Take. It was a New York Times bestseller. Adam's a Wharton professor. And the punchline of the book is that givers are more successful than takers. People who are willing to give over a long period of time end up being much more successful. Give first is a philosophy that says one should be willing to put energy into any system without defining a transactional relationship up front. It doesn't mean that it's altruism. Doesn't mean that it's necessarily, selfless. But you don't know what you're going to get back from whom, over what time period, and what consideration, and what magnitude. So you're willing to put energy into something just because you're willing to give first and see where things go. And, Young Entrepreneurs Organization and YPO, I think, are good organizational embellishments of that construct, right? They're organizations where people put a lot of energy into without necessarily saying, and I'm going to get this out of it. But they get immense things out of it that are way greater than what they put in. So I encourage all entrepreneurs to approach their work that way and their relationships that way, and just put some energy in. Doesn't mean that you put 99% of your energy in without defining anything. I've had people come to me with sort of the wise ass comment of, awesome, you have this give first attitude, so give me $5 million and I'll give you back something later. And I'm like,
you're like, no, that is not the point.
I can say no really quickly to that, but
yeah, right?
it's like, that's not how it works. But I'm willing to put some energy into what you're doing, even if I don't invest in your company. And then, you start to make some progress from there.
I absolutely love that. I think it's a great way to do business, and hopefully proves that nice guys and girls don't finish last, and, what you put out into the universe eventually comes back to you. So we're going to get to some of the live Q&A, because I could ask you questions all day, but I don't want to be selfish, and we do have some people watching from all over the place. So we're going to get to P. Talbert. He's got his hand raised to ask a live question for you, Brad. So hang on, and we're going to bring him in, okay?
Awesome.
Hey, Brad, can you hear me?
I can hear you great. I can even see you.
Fantastic. It's nice to talk with you. I've met your...
That's a good-looking old-school telephone you got.
Well, the audio is a little bit better. I appreciate it. But I actually had the chance to interact with your two co-founders. We just graduated the Techstars Cedars program, so thank you for setting that up.
Awesome.
My question concerns the startup visa that you referenced. We are actually in the process of recruiting a Chinese national from Vanderbilt here who has a master's in quantitative mathematics. And when you mentioned startup visa, I'm wondering is that a faster track? Could you talk about that versus an H-1B process? Because that is frustrating. And you're right, there's a ton of noise in the marketplace about that.
Yeah, the startup visa probably doesn't work for him in the context of where it is in the rulemaking, because the instantiation of it today is this international entrepreneurship parole program, which won't be valid until mid-July. However, okay. And send me an email, brad@feld.com, and I'm happy to help you. There's a couple of easy resources here. One is an organization called Global EIR. It's globaleir.org, which I'm co-chair of. That's a linkage between universities and companies, and helping entrepreneurs get visas at universities, because universities can get essentially unlimited or uncapped H-1B visas. And then that person at the university is an entrepreneur in residence at the university for at least a year. But during that year, they can work on or with startups. So that's a mechanism that could be useful. Another is, we just funded a company called Boundless. It's boundless.co, that's working on coming out with a very low-cost way for people to get visas and to navigate their way through the Byzantine visa system. And one of the founders is Doug Rand, who was at Office of Science and Technology Policy, OSTP, under the Obama administration. And he's very, very deeply wired into the different approaches for entrepreneurial visas. And he probably is the most, him and Craig Montori, who's the CEO of Global EIR, are probably the most informed about existing legal ways to get visas in your situation. So send me a note, and I'll make a couple of intros, and we'll see if we can help you.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Awesome. Thank you for asking that question. I think we're still waiting for a few more to come in, Brett. So I'm going to get back to something that you were talking about a little bit earlier in terms of getting rejected and hearing no. I want to talk a little bit about failure because entrepreneurs fail all the time. It's part of the process. Why is it important to fail?
I'll start from my own frame of reference and my own experience. I've failed at many things. And I've had many, not just companies fail that I've been involved in, whether I've been a founder or an investor, but many things along the way. And in some ways, a successful company is a process of surviving continuous failure. If you sort of step back and think about it in this intellectual way, what you've got is you're trying a bunch of experiments, and a lot of the experiments are simply not going to work. And if you have an experiment that's not working and you put all of your resources behind it and keep going, eventually your whole business will fail. Versus if you realize that this experiment isn't working, here's what I learned from the experiment. And then you take what you learned from it and apply it to the next experiment. When you find something that works, then you focus on scaling it up. So I think that, it's sort of a cliche, but the most useful thing that comes out of failure is the learning that you get. I would also suggest that failure has an incredible and understated emotional impact on people that can be very positive. When you're first starting out as an entrepreneur or anything in life and you haven't really failed, an athlete, whatever, and athletes fail pretty quickly because you lose, right? Games are binary. So you have this experience of winning and losing pretty early. But this notion of resilience, like this idea that, shit is hard. It doesn't work right. It takes forever. It's complicated. It doesn't go as expected. Exogenous factors that have nothing to do with you, blow up stuff that you thought was working. Relationships between human beings are messy because human beings are just big bags of chemicals. So all kinds of crazy stuff happens, especially when you're under stress. The resiliency that you develop by having failure along the way can either works for you if you develop resiliency. If you don't, or you sort of are afraid of or don't acknowledge the failure or don't learn from it, doesn't build that resiliency. So if you look at the best entrepreneurs, the most successful business people over a long period of time, they're unbelievably resilient. And the ones who, look great for a while and then blow up, and then you never hear from them again, are the ones that really didn't develop that resiliency that allows them to navigate through unknowns, difficult times, things that don't work.
That's a great point. I don't want to be selfish and keep interviewing you. So we're going to bring in other people again. We got another live question from N. Seaver. They're going to pop in a second here.
I was curious to get your perspective on the human instrumentation, I think, as you called it.
Yeah.
And specifically, it seems like wearables have hit a sort of plateau in the public mind in terms of what they can do for the user. Do you see any step changes in the actual sensors and the way the software analyzes the data such that the use cases for wearables will be significantly different 3, 5, 7 years from now?
Yeah, I think absolutely yes. When we invested in Fitbit in 2009, the phrase wearables didn't exist yet. And the market opportunity was non-existent. And in fact, when we made the investment, an awful lot of people said, why in the world would you ever invest in a digital pedometer? What a stupid idea. So what we viewed it as was the equivalent of version 0.1 of this developing activity. There had been some interesting companies already that emerged and had either failed or were on the verge of failing. One that we almost invested in that some people might remember from the distant past is a company called Zeo, which made an EEG sleep sensor. And so you put a little headband on and it was like a clock radio and it measured your brain waves, and it didn't even have an internet connection. It had a little SD card that came in and out of it. You took the SD card out and you plugged it into your laptop and it downloaded the day's data and then did some analysis with it. My wife loved it. She told me I looked incredibly sexy when I was wearing my little headband to bed. And she'd call me King Brad. It was my little crown. And the data was fascinating because it would give you not just asleep awake, but it would give you deep sleep, light sleep, and REM sleep, and in very granular measurements. And then over a period of time, sleep is becoming much, I would say, better understood in terms of how it impacts us and how it impacts our physiology. And the measurement of sleep is becoming a more important thing for certain categories of people who are chronically ill, people who have certain disease states, athletes, people that have significant recovery dynamics, people who travel a lot. Mental health disorders like depression and anxiety are exacerbated by poor sleep. If you look at, I'll use Fitbit as an example. If you look at Fitbit 2 years ago, their sleep tracking was using a technology called ephemetry, which is sort of awake asleep. And it was based on movement. And again, technology that the science had been around for a while that they did in a very, very accessible way, where all of a sudden your sleep data was quite good, but it wasn't the same level of sleep data based on the measurement system they had. If you roll that forward, they've recently come out with sleep data that's very similar to what you can get from that EEG type monitor monitoring your brainwaves, because they have such a massive amount of data anonymized across all the people that are sleeping, that they can use their own research tools to start to interpret the signal and say, oh, this corresponds to this kind of sleep, this corresponds to that kind of sleep. So even without necessarily changing the sensor packages, that sort of, whether you call it big data or machine learning, like you can get deeper into the actual understanding of how to present that information powerful way. So that's piece one. Piece two is, from my comment, it's 0.1, right? There's so many things that you can measure that as you start to get the measurements themselves, they're not that interesting, right? Do I care how much I sweat during the day? Do I care when I sweat, when I don't sweat? That's not so interesting. What's interesting is that data correlated to a bunch of other data. My heart rate data is a really good example of that. I'm a marathon runner, and my resting heart rate sort of hangs out between 58 and 70, let's say. And my normal resting heart rate is 58 to 60. Sometimes I see it below 58, but 58 to 60 means I'm well rested. If it gets up above 65, I need to rest. I should just, if I have a run that day, I shouldn't do the run. There's another measurement called HRV, which is heart rate velocity, which people are starting to really understand is a much better indicator of that. So even with the coarse grained data of need for rest, even with the coarse grained data of my heart rate, because I've been tracking it for so long, I can start to understand how I'm doing, even just with that data. But all of a sudden, when you can put it against something like HRV, link it to the number of miles I ran the previous day, what my workout load was for the previous week, that starts to be very predictive. So I don't think it's just the sensor dynamic now. I think the actual data and software is going to have a huge impact on the next wave of how we think about these technologies and rejuvenate in a lot of ways the incredible value of these types of products.
Thank you.
Great. Thanks for that answer, and thanks for asking that question. So Brad, we've got another question, but it's not live, so I'm going to ask it for this gentleman who wrote in. He said, hello, Brad. Greetings from Costa Rica. This is Alan Baroshowitz from Corral Ventures. I'm a partner of YPO member Carlos Quiros. My question is, you're a pioneer in developing startup ecosystems in places that are outside the big global tech hubs. So from your perspective, what are the minimum viable pieces that need to be in place for an innovation ecosystem to work in small emerging markets? We touched on that a bit with Steve and the rise of the restaurant earlier in the week, so it's nice to build on that. And obviously you have a ton of experience there too. So what do you think?
Sure. So in the book that I wrote in 2012, Startup Communities, I defined something I called the Boulder thesis that had 4 principles that you had to adhere to have a durable long-term startup community. And it's useful to recognize that in 2012, the phrase startup communities didn't exist, right? We called them entrepreneurial ecosystems or research clusters or some such thing. And the idea that you could create a startup community anywhere in the world didn't really exist. It was an idea that, as Steve would say, everybody was skeptical of. My assertion was that any city with at least 100,000 people could have a vibrant, long-lasting startup community. And in the book, I used Boulder as the example. It's not a book about Boulder, but it uses it as an example. And for those of you that don't know Boulder, it's where I live. Boulder's 100,000 people. So, it's not a big city. It's not 4 million people, 5 million people. And in fact, Denver, which is, our big city that's nearby, is 2 million people. Those four principles are simple. The first is that the leaders have to be entrepreneurs. Lots and lots of other types of people and types of organizations engage with the startup community, but in the absence of a critical mass of entrepreneurs who are acting as the leaders of the startup community, you won't build something that will sustain over time. The second is that you have to have a very long-term view. And when I say long-term, I mean at least 20 years. In addition, I've lived in Boulder now for 21 years. And so I don't have a minus 1 year view on it. I have a 20-year view from today. So I'm looking out to the next 20 years from year 21. So, year 41 is my endpoint now. So you have to always have this long-term forward-looking view. The third is you have to be inclusive of anyone who wants to engage at any level of anyone, regardless of pick your characteristics, first-time entrepreneur, experienced entrepreneur, whatever socioeconomic dynamics you are, whatever educational background you have, gender, race, ethnicity, sexual identity, historical experience. The immigration piece is a good example of motivation that comes out of that. Like, the more diversity you have, the more you get this creative energy, this creative activity, different kinds of ways of looking at and solving problems. But it's not just on, nationality and immigration. It's across all dimensions of diversity. Race, ethnicity, and gender are the easy ones, but keep on going. And then the fourth is that you have to have activities and events that engage people in entrepreneurship. It's okay to have, the Entrepreneur of the Year award where, you have a cocktail party and everybody gets, has a nice time with each other and somebody gets an award and whatever, and everybody drinks. It's fine to have, events. I like to say events at rich people's houses that are networking events. Those things are fine, but they're not what you need at the core. What you need at the core is things that allow you, activities that allow you to practice and engage in entrepreneurship. It's one of the motivations for Techstars, right? Which is a 90-day accelerator program that not only is focused on the people who go through the program, but also on the mentors who actively engage. Those mentors are almost always successful entrepreneurs or other successful people in the geographic community or in the vertical area that we're working in. And they engage deeply over that 90-day period with those companies. That's the act of entrepreneurship I'm talking about. Startup Weekend would be another example where, there's, 20 or 30 every weekend now happening somewhere all over the world. And it's a 54-hour simulation of entrepreneurship. You get together starting Friday, and at the end of the day on Sunday, the 70 to 100 people that you're with have generated a handful of companies. So that activity is so critical. So those are the four drivers. And really, I think that's it. All the rest of the stuff is additive to it. But in the absence of those four things, entrepreneurs as leaders, 20-year plus view, inclusivity of anyone who wants to engage, and activities for people to actually engage in entrepreneurship. You'll have maybe some excitement for a couple of years, but then, like what happens in so many things, it'll stall, or, when there's economic stresses, everybody will stop paying attention to entrepreneurship as something important. You'll end up in the zone where it's trendy versus structural.
That's great advice and great points. You mentioned mentorship, which I think is really key for people at any stage of a business, but especially early on. I know you mentor and work with young companies. How do you find the right mentors for your particular business? And I think it may go along with what you were saying about maybe an investment not being a right fit. How quickly do you know when maybe somebody that is requesting your mentorship isn't the right fit for you? What tips and advice would you give to people out there listening?
I'll start actually with something I think that's probably relevant for the YPO audience, which is that YPOers already have deeply engaged mentor relationships through Forum. And the ideal mentor relationship is a peer mentor relationship. It's where the mentor and the mentee are each learning from each other. My personal example of the mentor that probably has had the most impact on my life is a guy named Len Fassler, who was one of the two guys that bought my first company when I was in my late 20s. And Len's 86 today, and we're still extremely close. We talk regularly. We've done a number of businesses together over the years. But if you said to Len, has Brad learned more from you or have you learned more from Brad? He would say, oh, I've learned way more from Brad. And if you ask me, I wouldn't be here except for the experience of working with and learning from Len. That's where you want to get to. And interestingly, in Forum, you sort of start there, right? You have this set of peers who are in different levels in their business. You know, you might be running a $20 million business and somebody else might be running a $500 million business, but you're now in this peer mentor dynamic. So I like to try to encourage people to focus on that rather than go searching for a mentor. Find the people that are near you and develop those deep relationships, and then be open to the next one as they come. Mm-hmm. When somebody sends me an email and says, will you be my mentor? My answer is, why don't we just go back and forth on email for a while and get to know each other? Like, what's on your mind? Anything specific? And if somebody says, no, I just wanted to see if you'd be my mentor, well, that's useless to them. Forget about wasting my time. It's just totally useless to the person on the other side. But if they send me back a note that says, well, I'm working on this and I'm really struggling with this one issue. Can you give me any feedback on that? Or do you know anybody that can help me? I might give them some feedback and say, you know, these 3 people over here can really help you with that because they went through that same experience. So it's not that you're trying to get, you know, a famous person or a good name or something like that. What you're looking for are people who can relate to what you're doing, and back to this give first notion, are willing to put energy into you without knowing where it's going to lead.
That's really important and a great point. It's not just checking a box for somebody to have in your corner, because it might not be beneficial to either one of you. So we've got some questions coming in that I'm going to read. This is from Heidi Crane. She says, Brad, you made reference to human computer interaction and the increasing utilization of technology for personal monitoring, whether this be steps taken on a Fitbit or measuring daily caloric intake. Then you went on to mention the advances in type 1 diabetes and the closed loop blood sugar monitoring and insulin administration. Basically, my question is this: are you involved in the tech space that is working to develop this technology? And she says she's asking for a friend who's the mother of a type 1 diabetic.
Yeah, so I don't have any direct investments in the closed loop diabetes stuff. My dad's an endocrinologist, a retired endocrinologist, so I've been living around this for a long time, and he was very involved, I think in the 1970s or 80s in sort of step function advance in glucose monitors. So, you know, as a teenager, I was always hearing him talk about it. And it's just a very easy example because it's, you know, I think Steve Case talked about this some in his talk, sort of the challenge of, you know, regulatory dynamics and sort of where that lives on the curve. And I would assert, I'm not going to make it a data-driven statement, I'll make it an assertion that, you know, there's regulatory activity that's preventing this kind of technology. And, you know, I'm sure it's well-intentioned because the government, whoever in the regulatory agency, is afraid that, you know, something will go wrong with a closed loop system and somebody will die as a result of it. And they're not contemplating the fact that, you know, thousands of people or tens of thousands of people a year are dying because they have insulin shock or whatever the numbers are, right? You know, and the number of people who would benefit significantly against that risk. So we have this challenge with technology is, I'll sort of generalize the construct, the challenge of, wow, technology is really advancing, but I'm scared of the potential risk. And yet I don't understand what the actual current cost of not having this solution is, right? Self-driving cars is another one I think that the next 3 or 4 years is going to be in our face, right? There's still, I don't know how many auto accidents a year. The number's a big number. It's probably too big. There's a lot less deaths because we have airbags and we have much safer cars than we used to have. Mm-hmm. But there's still a fair number of people who die each year. And there's a lot of accidents that are happening because people are, you know, texting on their phone or looking up the next person to call or distracted or whatever. And if you take self-driving cars to the next level, there's still going to be some risk that self-driving cars have crashes. But what's the trade-off? What's the benefit of that relative to current state? And I think that's a struggle that as a society and as a species, frankly, we're gonna have for the next 10 or 20 years in a really profound way, because we're still talking about things that we can kind of identify with, right? Self-driving cars, diabetes, like they're things we kind of understand. What happens when we get to things we don't understand? And there's a long list of them that have to do with tighter integration into us. What happens when we come up with an invention I'll give my favorite example. Everybody says, what would you want to invest in? Like if I showed up with this thing that would cause you to say yes immediately, what is it? And my answer is a portable teleportation machine. I could get in a box that teleported me wherever I wanted to go. And when I got there, I still had the box with me, so that when I wanted to teleport somewhere else, I would just get into the box. And you say, well, what risk would you take for that box? Well, I would not take the risk that 1 in 1,000 times I would die. But I would take the risk that 1 in 1,000 times I'd lose one of my fingers. Okay?
Okay.
It'd be worth it to me. Like, it's not a cumulative risk, right? One out of 1,000 times I might lose a finger. I take that risk. So sort of where are we on the risk profile curve against this technology? And sort of who is making that decision? Is the government making the decision? Are we as individuals making the decision? And oh, by the way, we're going to get to the place with a lot of this technology where the government can't control it. There's a very famous quote. I don't know who came up with it, but I've heard it many, many times, is that the law does not keep up with technology. Mm-hmm. And, you see it in lots of different places in lots of different industries. And basically legal frameworks are such that they're always being challenged by innovation. And they're holding back innovation rather than evolving at pace with it. And I think that's just something that as human beings, we're going to have to get used to.
So, Brad, I think we've got time for one more quick question and answer, and then we're going to send it back over to Keith. So this is from Jan Shumby from Cape Town. What would your advice be for entrepreneurs in terms of finding the balance between pivoting and failing fast on the one hand versus showing grind and resilience through tough times on the other? And thank you.
I don't think they're mutually exclusive. Here's the problem with both pivot, the word pivot and failing fast. I sort of made this allusion earlier. The word, the phrase theme became so generic as to mean nothing. Mm-hmm. A pivot has become generic also in such a way as to mean nothing. When pivot first emerged with the idea around lean startup in the writing of Eric Ries, and I don't know, almost a decade ago now, the idea behind a pivot was not that you were starting off to do a video conferencing business, and then you decided that you were going to make a business that sold banana bread, right? It wasn't like this, I'm doing this and now I'm radically doing this other thing. It was that you're making all these continuous adjustments based on the result of your experiments. And if you run a bunch of experiments that don't work, but you find something else, you pivot to it. But there's still some linkage between those things. That's very different than saying this business didn't work, I'm shutting it down, and now I'm starting a new business. Same with fail fast. The idea of fail fast was run experiments and fail fast on the experiments, mm-hmm. right? Like, it's not that you should start a business, raise $1 million, try it, it doesn't work, fail, quit, do the next one. It's that you should be continually doing these experiments, and when they come up false, don't keep doing them. Learn from it and evolve. So I actually think that I'll use resilience as the key word. I think that if people learn how to fail fast and make these continuous small pivots, by the way, it's not just at the beginning of your business, but it's through the life of your company. And some of those things are a function of what's happening and the experiments you run, but some are a function of what's happening exogenously, right? And they could be things that pull you towards or pull you away from something. I would suggest that if you were working on a product that allowed you to do telephone calls or audio conferencing using Amazon's Alexa technology after Amazon's release 2 days ago, I'd probably pivot because Amazon just integrated that into, the Alexa. So it's using it from that frame of reference, and the resiliency comes out of having to do that over and over again in the quest for successful business. And when you have success, you then develop resiliency because you built up that muscle over a long period of time.
Great. Well, Brad, thank you so much for giving us an hour of your time today. We know you're a super busy guy, and this was really insightful, I'm sure, for everyone. And quick side note, I am actually heading to a shoot with the Techstars grad company this afternoon in New York City called JewelBots. They make friendship bracelets.
Totally fun company. Yeah, super fun company. So have a good time, and I always love doing an interview with you, so holler anytime.
Thank you so
Brad,
much.
don't hang up yet, Brad.
I'm not going to. I'm going to sit here until Keith says I'm released.
Okay,
All right,
good.
Keith, back over to you.
Great. Well, first of all, thank you, Kate, so much for your participation in Innovation Week and our partnership with CNBC. We love you guys and your coverage of business and innovation and entrepreneurship. So thank you, Kate. Brad, you're a dear friend, and I've known you for years, but thank you also for sharing and giving first to our many members that are going to see this live, and also some people are going to see it later taped. I do have one question before we hang up. We talked about pivot, which is a word, and those type of things, but, we've got people all over the world, and, you and Steve Case and everybody talks about you don't have to be in Silicon Valley. But if you're talking to hundreds of YPOers right now, from a third-generation tire company to a new startup, what are the one or two points that you would tell them to do today? Not 5 years ago. What are the one or two points that you would say a fourth-generation tire company or a new startup? What are the three Brad Feld points?
Number one, carve out some time for yourself soon, today, this weekend, and make sure you are obsessed about what you're working on. And it's worth doing it on a regular basis. The most successful founders and the most successful CEOs I know are continuously obsessed about what they're working on. When they find themselves not obsessed about what they're working on, they either lose interest, get distracted, and mess up their company, or they get unhappy with life even if they're successful. So start from that frame of reference. Make sure that what you're spending your time on is what you want to spend your time on. Second, and this is something I've had to learn over a long period of time. Keith knows this, probably many, some of you that know me know this. I've struggled with my own mental health issues as an adult. I've had 3 serious depressive episodes, one in my 20s, one in my 30s, and one in my 40s. And this idea of self-care, and in the context of this unbelievably intense thing called entrepreneurship and business, against the backdrop of a very, very intense life, making sure you're creating time and space for yourself, for your family, for the people that you're put on this planet to be with, and understanding that it's not work-life balance. You'll never get balance, but it's harmony. It's this idea that the two are interwoven in a way that feed you rather than starve you. So that would be the second. And then the third is put yourself in a position where no matter what you're doing, you're always learning. The lights will go out one day and it'll be over. And I don't care what you believe about the afterlife, or whether you're like me and you think that the ants get to eat you after you die. Put yourself in the position where you're constantly learning, so that you're endlessly stimulated along this journey. One of the things I've seen with people when they've been successful for a while, or people at the very beginning of their journey, is they get, I don't want to say arrogant, they just stop listening to new stimuli. You start to feel like you know. And yeah, you know a bunch of stuff, even if you don't know that much. But there's a bunch of stuff you don't know, and a bunch of stuff you know might be wrong and could be wrong in the future. And oh, by the way, we're living in this world where there's no way to know everything anymore. So making sure you're constantly stimulating yourself in different ways. My dad is just turned 79 relatively recently, and it's so awesome to watch him continue to explore and learn new things as a way of keeping his brain healthy, independently from this notion of what he's actually trying to accomplish. So those would be my 3 ending things.
Well, great. Well, first of all, 3 great things, and thank you for providing those. Brad, you've done so much for entrepreneurs and for successful business people, and I love that you're 100% open, and I think that's great. So thank you. And also just, this year we signed a pretty interesting deal with Brad's help and his co-founders in Techstars. So YPO and Techstars have a major relationship from, we're just getting starting, but from mentoring, from helping Techstars go global in some areas where we have members in. There's just a lot of things that we're putting together. So for the YPOers, there's so much opportunity, really give first, but win-win also. in the Techstars YPO relationship, and we'll be talking more about that. So on what's coming up, we're finishing up Innovation Week tomorrow afternoon, and we're going, events around the globe. But tomorrow we close the NASDAQ market. So if you want to join in live, go to NASDAQ's Facebook page, and you'll see a bunch of YPOers closing the market, and get to hit the button, even though it's not a real button. So that'll be fun. And the other is we've got 2 live Facebook Lives coming out of New York tomorrow with the founder of Smartsheet, who's a YPOer. Those guys are doing unbelievable with collaboration. And a really high-profile guy at Microsoft, our partner, talking about all the new stuff going on with Microsoft Surface and how they're going to change work. Thank you so much, Brad and Kate, and thank you for joining us. And we'll talk to you soon. Go to ypoinnovationweek.com for more information. Bye-bye.
Thank you.
See y'all.